Today we're taking a look at Advent of Vue coding challenge number 6. This is probably the most interesting one yet. It has a lot more depth than the previous ones, so it's going to give us a bit more room to explore different solutions. I'm going to show you my solution, which is very different from the author's recommended solution. We're going to talk a little bit about composables, how to separate business logic and your interface layer, and we're going to write some tests. Let's go ahead now and get started. The goal of this puzzle is to build this very simple application. We need to fetch a list of products from an API endpoint and display them in two different selects. You then select two items, and we're going to show you a message which tells you how many of the cheaper item you could buy instead of buying one of the more expensive item. So for example, instead of buying one iPhone, you could buy 69 bottles of perfume oil. Let's go ahead now and get started. Just to save a little bit of time, I did prepare some code ahead of time. I'm just going to show you that very quickly. The first thing we have is this item select component, and that is basically going to be this select drop down here. You can see we're missing some props. We're going to provide those in just a moment. Basically, it's just set up with a very simple V model. We're going to receive the V model item, which is going to be a kind of complex object, an item object, which has an ID, a price, and a title. We're then going to receive a second argument or a second prop. It's going to be an array of all the items. We're then just going to loop over them and display them all. And whenever we change the item, we're going to go ahead and emit an update model value event. And that's going to have the correct object, which is going to be that complex item object. We're then going to receive that in the top and do what we will with it. The other thing I did was set up a little function over here just to fetch those items from the endpoint. It's just going to go ahead, make a request, and return those items. This is all fairly straightforward, which is why I didn't want to spend too much time typing this out in front of you. The first thing we're going to do is go ahead and fix up these compilation errors. Then we're going to talk about our strategy to solving this problem. The first thing we're going to need is two refs to save this data, so I'm going to go ahead and create those now. I'm going to start off with item A, which is going to be a ref. It's going to be an item, so we're just going to pass that one in, and it can also be undefined. We're going to have one more, which I'm going to call item B, and that is also going to be nullable. Finally, it looks like my interface was not imported, so I'm just going to go ahead now and import that one. It's going to come from fetch items. Now those compilation errors are going to be gone if we go ahead and pass these items. Let's start off by doing that. We're just going to use vmodel, passing in item A. We're going to do the same thing down here for item B. The next thing we need to do is get a list of all the items. I have a function for that too, so I'm just going to go ahead and import the fetch items function, and we're just going to go and call fetch items. This is going to return an array of objects of items, so we're going to need to save that somewhere as well. Let's just go ahead and create a third ref. This one's going to be an array of items, and it's going to default to just being an empty array. Finally, we're going to fetch that and then assign it inside of here. As I like to do, I'm going to create a separate function for this, an asynchronous function called getItems, and that's just going to go ahead and wrap my logic. Let's drop this inside of here and await for that result. Then I'm going to say items.value is equal to res, and that should give me my list of items. Finally, we are going to need to call that at some point, so let's go ahead and do that. And we can finally pass in our items, and that is going to get rid of that error. And we're going to do the same thing down here as well. With a bit of luck, we should now be rendering an array or a select of items. Let's head over to our browser and see if that one's working. It's going to refresh the page, and we do have our list of items here. I can see them being displayed here as well, so everything looks like it is working correctly. Just to clarify what's happening here, I'm going to head back to item select, and I am displaying the inline value here, just to prove that this is working correctly. If I go ahead and change this, it is going to change. I am confident this is working, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and now everything is gone, and I can go ahead and select my two items. Now that we've finished implementing that, we're going to get into the more interesting part, which is going to be writing our logic to do the comparison, and then figuring out how to wire it all up, which is probably the most complex part of any system, how the different parts, functions, and data interact, and how the data is going to flow through it. What I would like to do is develop this in isolation. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new function, and that is going to handle all my comparisons. I've actually got a file for this already called item comparison. This came with the boilerplate code. It doesn't do anything yet, and I'm just going to leave this empty function here for now. I'm going to go ahead and create a new function, and I'm just going to call this one compare for now. It's going to take two arguments, the first item and the second item. So I'm just going to call this item A, and we're also going to call the second one item B. This is going to return a string, and that's going to tell us what message we need to render on the screen. So that's going to render this message down here. There is one other requirement I forgot to mention, which is if the items have the same price, we're just going to render the items have the same price, because it wouldn't make too much sense to say you could buy one or the other. Before we go any further, we're actually going to test-driven development this, or use TDD to develop this. What I'm going to do is use vtest, which is a very simple Node.js test runner, and that's going to give us a nice quick feedback loop. So let's go ahead and start that one up. The first thing we're going to need to do is create that file, so I'm just going to go ahead and create the item comparison.spec.ts. Finally, if I do npx vtest, it should go ahead and run that spec for me. And there we go. Before we go any further, I'm just going to make this a bit smaller so we can actually see what's going on left to right. This is probably my favorite way to do test-driven development. I like to see the feedback loop side by side with my code. You can see if I save it off, nothing's happening because I haven't actually got any tests yet. So let's go ahead and start writing that test out now. First thing we're going to do is go ahead and say describe, which is going to be imported from vtest. We're going to grab the rest of these as well. I'm going to be describing my compare function. We're going to start off with just the different test cases. There's basically two different types of values we can return here. One is going to be that comparison message, and the other is going to be saying that both of the items have the same price. So let's go ahead and stub out both of those tests. The first one's going to be say it shows a message for items with the same price. And that's obviously going to be a fairly simple one to write. And we're going to have the other one as well, which is just going to be shows the correct comparison. These probably aren't the most descriptive messages, but these will do just for the purpose of getting something working here. If we save this off, that is going to execute. We have no failures because we haven't actually got any code yet. So let's go ahead and have a little bit of a think about how this API or how this interface is going to look. I'm going to go ahead and create some feature data for now. Let's start off with item A. This is going to be an item, and we're just going to go ahead and create something very basic. I'm going to say the title is just going to be A, and the price can just be 50. We're going to have something similar for item B, so it's going to be the comparison item. We're just going to call this one B, and I'm going to give this one a price of 5. So if everything goes according to plan, instead of buying one of item A, you could buy 10 of item B. Let's go ahead now and call out the function. So I'm going to say const actual is equal to compare. It's going to be imported. We're going to pass in item A, and we're going to pass in item B. Before I go any further, I'm actually going to write this test first because it's much easier. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to show you a really neat trick here just to get this working really quickly. But before I do, let's go ahead and try and implement it and just see if everything is working. So what we're going to do is jump inside of here and do our comparison. I'm going to see if a.price is exactly the same as b.price. And of course, if it is, we're going to return that message. I'm just going to say items have the same price. We're going to jump down here and just return an empty string for now. Let's save this one off. Now I need to go ahead and assert against this string. There are a few ways I could do this. I could just copy paste it, but there is one other neat trick which is going to work with both vtest and jest. I'm going to go ahead and write my assertion here and assert that the actual to match inline snapshot. This is going to go ahead, and if the argument is empty, it's going to paste in the first result. Save it off, and there is our result. We are getting this empty string here. This is actually not what I was expecting because these have different prices, so this is going to be incorrect. Let's go ahead and fix this up and watch the failure, and then we're going to update our snapshot. I'm going to have the same price here, so the price is going to be item a.price. If we save this off, it is now going to fail, and this is exactly what I was expecting. Finally, I can go ahead, remove this, and it's going to update that value automatically. Just to make sure everything's working, I can watch it fail again, and now I can watch it pass. I generally don't use snapshots too much, but this is a really neat way just to bootstrap some data and get my tests passing as quickly as possible. It's very useful for prototyping. So now that that one is passing, I'm going to go ahead and remove the only, and we're going to do the other one down here. This is going to be the more interesting one. What I am going to do is just talk about the logic a little bit, and then we're going to write the test. So we have a few different options here. We don't know if A or B is going to be more expensive. So what we could do is do two comparisons. We could do something like a.price is less than b.price. Then we would do one thing. Then we could flip this around and do the opposite. What I would rather do is just go ahead and sort out these in the first place, A and B, so we have the same comparison either way. That way we only have one conditional. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say cheap and expensive, and we're going to go ahead and then sort out the array. So I'm just going to say, make a new array with A and B, and then we're going to go ahead and sort this one out. This is going to be a fairly simple comparison. We're just going to say a.price is greater than y.price. If it is, we're going to return 1, otherwise we're going to return -1. Just to see if this is doing what I'm expecting, I'm going to do a console log in here and save it off. We can see this is working correctly. The cheap one is going to be B, which is 5, and the more expensive one is going to be A, which is going to be 50. So this is working as I was expecting. Now we need to go ahead and do our comparison. I'm going to say const diff, which is just going to be the difference between these two, so how many times one can be divided into the other. We can just say expensive.price divided by cheap.price. Finally, I don't want to show something like 4.1, it doesn't make sense, so I'm just going to go ahead and round this one down. That's going to be our number, and now we just need to go ahead and return our message. So I'm going to say, instead of buying the expensive one, you could buy many of the cheap ones. So instead of buying one, and then we're going to pass in the expensive item.title, I have lost my code, there we go. You can buy, and in this case, we're going to show the number, so it's going to be diff number of, and then we're going to pass in the cheaper one, cheap.title. Let's go ahead now and save this one off. Finally, we haven't got our assertion, so let's go ahead and use that snapshot trick one more time. If we jump down here, we can go ahead and do exactly the same thing, pasting in this. I'm going to watch it fail. Of course, it is failing, and this message does look pretty good. Instead of buying 1A, you can buy 10 number of B. I could probably make this a little bit better, buying 1 number of, but this is going to be fine for now. You can fix this message up in your own time if you want. Just going to go ahead, delete this, and update my snapshot. And there we have it. That looks pretty good, and both of these tests are passing. So I'm fairly confident all my logic is now working correctly. Before I go on, I am going to fix up this message just to make it a little bit nicer. Instead of buying 1 item, you can buy, actually no, this is perfectly grammatically correct. I'm going to leave it. So now we have our logic. Notice we haven't used any of our Vue interactivity or reactivity APIs. It's all very simple JavaScript. And this was one of the reasons it was so easy to test. Simple values in, simple values out. This is a pure function. Regardless of how many times I call this, we're going to get the exact same results, and it has no side effects. I like this kind of code. It's easy to reason about, and it's easy to work with. Finally, we need to go ahead and integrate this to our Vue layer. So let's see how we might do that. First thing we're going to do is head back to app.vue, and we're going to need to import our function, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Let's go ahead and see if this imports automatically. I have a feeling it's not going to. Compare, hey, it actually worked. That's pretty nice. So now we have our comparison here. Finally, every time one of these items changes, we're going to go ahead and rerun our comparison. So all that means we need to do is create a new computed property. I'm just going to call it message for now. It is going to be computed, and this is going to recompute whenever item A or item B changes. The next thing we need to do is jump inside of here and just return compare, passing in item A.value and item B.value. With a bit of luck, this should work. It's going to head down here and render my message. We are getting an error here, and that's because both of these are nullable. So what we're going to do is just go ahead and do a check. We're going to see if item A is null or if item B is null. And if either of these is null, I'm just going to go ahead and return an empty string. I think that should be just fine. Let's go ahead and give this one a try. Going to head back to my browser now and see if everything is working. So I'm going to buy one iPhone 10. I'm going to go ahead and buy something cheap, such as a Dal Mastor 500 grams, whatever that is. And this does look pretty good to me. Instead of buying one iPhone 10, I could buy 44 of whatever this item is supposed to be. I'm just going to do a quick sanity check here. I would expect that if I do this calculation, it is roughly 20, and that's what I was expecting. So everything is now working correctly. We should also see if the same price one is working. I'm almost 100% confident it is, and so it is. That is working exactly as I was expecting. The next thing we're going to do is take a look at the author's solution and see how that works, and then I'm going to make a final refactor to my solution. So let's just quickly review our solution here. We have all of our logic inside of the compare and fetch items functions. Fetch items is very simple. It just makes a request to an endpoint. There's no Vue reactivity here. Item comparison is much the same. It's just a very simple function. And finally, we bring it all together inside of our component file using our reactivity APIs such as computed and such as ref. Let's go ahead now and see how the author solved it. And we're going to see a drastically different way to approach this problem. If we head into our source directory, we have a few different files. We'll check out app first. So app is fairly simple. It does everything inside of onMounted. It just goes ahead and fetches the API data, which makes sense. He's then assigning this value to something called available items, which is destructured from the use item comparison composable. Finally, we have two item selects down here, neither of which receives an argument, which tells me that they are using some sort of global data. And then we have our comparison summary, which is presumably going to be that message. It's only going to be rendered if there's two items to compare. So that's kind of how he's doing that check. Instead of doing this, we have something a little bit different in my code base. I have this check over here, but it is kind of the same thing. Finally, let's go ahead and take a look at the rest of the code. The most interesting one is going to be the use items comparison function and comparison summary. Going to head back here now and take a look at the Composables directory, which contains items comparison. And we can see this is where all of the data is saved. We have these three up here. Items to compare is an array, so that's going to contain those two elements that we're comparing. And this is just whether we're fetching the data and the entire list of items. This is going to be global, so it would not be possible to have multiple comparisons in this application. He would be limited to having one copy, which probably makes sense for this particular application. If we now head into components, we're going to see how these are consumed. First one is going to be item select, and this one is fairly straightforward. It's just a very basic select, and you can see it's getting the data from items to compare. It's going to go ahead and loop over those, available items. We're then caching that data locally inside of here. Every time one is selected, it's going to go ahead, do a comparison and remove a duplicate item, and then it's going to push it into an array. Finally, if we head back to the other components file, there is the comparison summary. Should probably make this a little bit bigger. I'm kind of regretting not doing that earlier. We have a computed property here, which inevitably is going to do the same thing as our computed property. It does that comparison. It does the math.floor exactly the same as what we were doing. We then have a bunch of other computed properties. We have expensive, cheap, is items the same, and we also have is items sorted by price descending. We don't do this in our application, but I guess it's nice to sort those things out. So there's quite a few differences here. In this particular application, the author has quite a large number of computed properties. That's to sort the items out, expensive and cheap. We sidestep this problem by separating our business logic, or our basic functional code, from our Vue interactivity layer. We don't need to have these computed properties because we simply just go ahead and sort everything out. We do that over here. I feel like this is a little bit better. We've got the comparison logic and cheap and expensive all in the same place, which does make a lot of sense to me. I feel like some of the logic in this particular application is leaking outside of the composable into the application code or into the Vue component. It's not really a bad thing, it's just a different way to design this. But you can see this is kind of having an effect on the entire system. Use items comparison probably should contain most of the logic, but it actually just contains a number of variables. Everything is sort of spread all over the place. This component has the comparison, and then we have some other logic related to adding those items back in the select components. My understanding here is the author wanted to encapsulate all the comparison data inside of the component called comparison summary, so I can definitely see where he's coming from. What would be really nice though, for both my application or my answer and for the author's answer, is if we could move some of this complexity inside of the use item comparison. Since this is where I think it really belongs, this function clearly compares items, so why haven't we got all the comparison data inside of here? So to finish this one off, I'm going to make a refactor and attempt to move all of my logic inside of my use item comparison. In practice, I'm not convinced this is even a great idea. I think this solution is just fine. I have all my data here, which makes perfect sense. It's all used locally, and then I just pass it down as props. This could not be any more simple or straightforward. Having said that, in a larger, more complex system, maybe you do want to start encapsulating some of this complexity inside a composable. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and grab all of this code and attempt to move it to the composable that came with this template. That is this composable over here, use item comparison. So I'm just going to paste all of this inside of here. What I'm not going to do is move any of this logic from compare inside of here. I still want my business logic and my core functionality to be separate from my Vue layer. They're in the same file, but that's irrelevant. The fact is that they are separated in terms of the functions. Finally, we need to get our fetch items. So let me go ahead and import that one. We're also going to need computed. So let's go ahead and import that one as well. All my compilation errors are now gone, which is definitely nice. all we need to do is return everything that we need from this useItemComparison function. I'm going to go ahead and do that one now. We do have to call getItem still, so I'm going to call that one here. We're just going to go ahead and return item A, item B, and items. That should be all we need. We're actually going to need message as well. Let's go ahead now, fix up our compilation errors, and make sure everything is still working correctly. The first thing we're going to need to do is grab our composable, which is called useItemComparison, and I'm just going to go ahead and destructure that. So everything is going to come from the useItemComparison composable. Item A, we're going to grab item B, we're going to grab items, and we're also going to go ahead and grab message. So we only have one copy of items. Every time you call useItemComparison, you're actually going to retrigger all of this. We're going to get a new list of items. We're going to have a new item A and item B. So this is not going to be an example of a global state composable. Every time you call this, you're going to get a new one. I am happy with this refactor. I actually think this is a little bit better. Now I can have multiple comparisons in my application, but that is going to depend on the application you are building. If you wanted this to be global, all you would need to do is head over here, copy this and paste it outside, which is what is done in the author's original solution. I'm still going to continue passing these array of items down. I think this is much better. I don't think the item select should be very smart about getting data. I think it should be dumb and just receive items in terms of props. This is kind of one of the basic ways you do things in frameworks like Vue and React. Finally, I'm going to delete all these, which does vastly simplify our application code, or at least our component. And with a bit of luck, this should still all work. Let's go ahead and check it out. So let's go ahead and choose 2 items, and that is working as expected. Instead of buying 1 Microsoft Surface laptop, you can buy 3 Huawei P30 phones. So I'm not too sure which is better here. Some people do like this style where you put all the logic inside of here, and I can see that makes sense. One thing I do like is having all this logic separate. Now the last thing we would like to think about is how we might like to test the rest of this. Obviously we've tested compare, that's working fine. I'm confident that's still working fine. The real question is, how do we test this composable? I generally do not test composables in isolation. The whole point of these is to be consumed by other components. So what I would recommend is testing this using something like an end-to-end or a component test. That's what I'm going to recommend doing, and that's what we're going to do right now. Welcome back. We're now going to go ahead and finish up by writing some tests. I'm going to be using Cypress, the best way to test your components. Just to make this test a little bit easier to write, I've gone ahead and added these data size selectors to my selects, just to make it easy to find and orchestrate this test. I've also set up a very basic test. It currently doesn't do anything, but that's about to change very soon. We are going to have 2 tests. One is going to be where the items have the same price, and one is going to be where they have a different price. Let's start off with the one where they have the same price. So the first thing we're going to need to do is go ahead and select 2 of our items. So I'm going to say sci.get and go ahead and grab my very first select, which is going to be data sci, and that's going to be equal to select 1. Now that we have that, we can go ahead and select our item. I can just go ahead and say select and pass in the item I'd like to select. I'm going to go ahead and select the iPhone 9, which is $549. So I should be able to say iPhone 9, $549. Save it off and see what happens. It worked. Let's do exactly the same thing for the second select. If we save that one off, they both have the same price, and now we have the correct message. Let's go ahead and write that assertion. Currently the message hasn't got a div or anything, so I'm going to give it a div. I'm going to also give this one a data sci, and I'm just going to call this one a message for now. Again, probably not the best. What you should really be doing is using something like an accessibility selector or accessibility attribute, but I think this is going to be just fine, just to get our test working. Finally, let's go ahead and write this assertion. I'm going to say sci.get, and as you would expect, we're going to go ahead and grab this one. So let's just go ahead and copy paste that one and throw it inside. Having a bit of trouble doing that. There we go. We also need to have our surrounding square brackets. And then we're just going to go ahead and write the assertion. So I can say should have text and pass in the text, which is going to be items have the same price. With a bit of luck, this is going to work. Let's save it off, and hopefully our test is going to pass. So it does. The final thing we're going to need is the opposite test, or the test where they have a different amount of pricing. So let's go ahead and write that one as well. Just going to go ahead and select a different item. Let's say we choose something cheap with a short name. Tree oil 30 mils, $12. So I'm going to go ahead and say tree oil 30 mils, which is going to cost me $12. Let's go ahead and save this off, and this one should fail, and so it does. This is the text. What I'm going to do is go ahead and copy and paste this one inside. With a bit of luck, this is going to pass. I'm certain it is going to pass, and everything is now working. There is some potential improvements we could make here. We may not want to hit a real API. We may like to use something like site intercept to avoid doing that. Just because this video is getting fairly long, I'm not going to do that one, but definitely would recommend doing that so you're not relying on a third-party service during your tests. That does bring me to the end of this particular coding challenge. I think this is a really interesting one, maybe because it gave us a lot of depth and a lot of room to kind of express different solutions. If you have a different solution, please share. Alternatively, if you have an opinion about my solution and the author's solution, I would love to hear that one as well. Either way, that's all I've got for now, so I will see you in the next video.